Anderson Cooper thought he could destroy Karoline Leavitt's political career with a hostile interview designed to make her look inexperienced and extreme. What happened next ended his 20-year CNN career and proved that preparation beats reputation every time. The CNN studios in Manhattan felt unusually tense that Tuesday evening in September, as producers scurried between monitors and makeup artists made final preparations for what everyone knew would be a contentious interview. Anderson Cooper sat in his familiar anchor chair, reviewing his notes for what he'd privately called his takedown interview, a systematic destruction of the young Republican congresswoman who'd been making waves with her unapologetic conservative positions and viral social media presence. Representative Karoline Leavitt sat across from him in the guest chair, wearing a sharp navy blazer and carrying herself with the confidence of someone half Cooper's age, but twice as prepared for battle. At 26, she was one of the youngest members of Congress representing New Hampshire's 1st District after a stunning upset victory that had shocked the political establishment. Her youth and telegenic appearance had made her a rising star in conservative media, but also a target for liberal journalists who saw her as an easy mark. Cooper had been planning this interview for weeks, ever since Leavitt had criticized CNN's coverage of immigration policy during a Fox News appearance. His research team had compiled what they called a comprehensive opposition file, controversial statements from her campaign social media posts from her college years, and policy positions they believed would make her look extreme to CNN's audience. As the red light blinked on and the familiar CNN theme played, Cooper launched into what he thought would be a routine demolition of a political newcomer. Good evening, I'm Anderson Cooper, and tonight we're joined by Representative Karoline Leavitt, the 26-year-old Republican from New Hampshire, who's been making headlines with some rather controversial statements about immigration, healthcare, and social policy. He looked directly at her with the practiced authority of someone who'd spent 2 decades interviewing world leaders and celebrities. Congresswoman, you've called for mass deportations, opposed abortion rights, even in cases of rape and incest, and suggested that climate change is a hoax. These are pretty extreme positions for someone representing a purple state like New Hampshire. It was classic Cooper. Take complex policy positions, strip away all nuance, and present them in the most inflammatory way possible to put his guest on the defensive immediately. But Leavitt had been expecting this exact approach. She'd spent hours studying Cooper's interview techniques, watching how he handled other conservative guests, and preparing for every possible line of attack. Anderson, I appreciate you having me on, but I have to correct several mischaracterizations in your question, she began, her voice calm but carrying an edge that suggested she wasn't going to be steamrolled. I've never called for mass deportations. I've called for enforcing existing immigration law, which includes deporting people who are here illegally and have committed additional crimes. That's not extreme. That's literally what the law requires. Cooper tried to interrupt, but Leavitt continued smoothly. I've also never said climate change is a hoax. Sornery. I've questioned specific climate policies that would destroy American jobs while having no measurable impact on global temperatures. There's a difference between climate skepticism and policy skepticism. She leaned forward slightly. And regarding abortion, I've consistently stated my position that I believe life begins at conception. But I've also said that any legislation needs to include exceptions for the life of the mother. You're misrepresenting my actual positions to make them sound more extreme than they are. Cooper's confident expression flickered for just a moment. This wasn't the defensive response he'd expected from someone he'd assumed would be easily rattled. Well, Congresswoman, let's talk about your qualifications, Cooper said, shifting to what he thought would be safer ground. You're 26 years old, you've been in Congress for less than a year. And before that, your only experience was working as a press secretary. What makes you think you're qualified to make decisions about complex national issues? It was a question designed to make Leavitt look presumptuous and unqualified, the kind of ageist attack that usually worked against young politicians who hadn't yet learned how to handle hostile media. But Leavitt was ready for this too. That's an interesting question, Anderson, especially coming from someone who's never held elected office, never run a campaign, and never had to answer to voters for his decisions. She tilted her head slightly. You're 56 years old, you've been in journalism for over 20 years, and you're asking me about qualifications. So let me ask you, what qualifies you to question elected officials about their policy positions? What's your expertise in immigration law, healthcare policy, or economic development? The studio fell silent except for the hum of cameras. Cooper looked genuinely taken aback. Guests weren't supposed to question his credentials. "I'm a journalist," he said defensively. "My job is to ask tough questions." "Your job is supposed to be asking fair questions based on accurate information," Leavitt replied. "But you opened this interview with multiple mischaracterizations of my positions. That's not journalism. That's advocacy disguised as journalism." She pulled out her phone and showed it to the camera. "Before coming on this show, I looked up your background, Anderson. You inherited millions from your mother, Gloria Vanderbilt. You went to Yale because your family had connections. You got your first job at Channel One because of family influence." Cooper was starting to look uncomfortable, shifting in his chair as Leavitt continued. "Meanwhile, I grew up in a working-class family in New Hampshire. I worked my way through college, started at the bottom in politics, and won my congressional seat by convincing 180,000 voters that I could represent their interests. So when you question my qualifications, you're really questioning the judgment of the people who elected me." She leaned back in her chair. "Which brings me to an important point about this interview. You invited me on this show not to have a substantive policy discussion, but to try to make me look bad. You're using your platform not to inform your audience, but to attack a young woman who represents views you disagree with." Cooper tried to regain control of the interview. "Congresswoman, I think you're being overly sensitive." "Overly sensitive," Leavitt interrupted, her voice sharpening. "Anderson, you just spent 5 minutes misrepresenting my positions and questioning my qualifications. Now you're telling me I'm being overly sensitive for correcting the record. That's exactly the kind of condescending attitude that voters rejected when they elected me." She turned to address the camera directly. "This is what's wrong with mainstream media. They don't want to engage with conservative ideas. They want to caricature them. They don't want to understand why millions of Americans support politicians like me. They want to dismiss us as unqualified or extreme." Cooper was visibly flustered now, his usual smooth delivery completely gone. "Look, I'm just trying to ask the questions that our viewers want answered." "Your viewers want answered or you want answered?" Leavitt pressed. "Because I've looked at CNN's ratings, Anderson. Your show has lost 60% of its audience over the past 2 years. Maybe the problem isn't that Americans are too stupid to appreciate your journalism. Maybe the problem is that your journalism has become too biased for Americans to trust." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze, unsure whether they should keep rolling. "Here's what I think is really happening." Leavitt continued, her voice taking on a more conversational tone. "You invited me on the show because you thought you could easily discredit a young conservative woman. You assume that because I'm 26, because I'm new to Congress, because I'm not part of the Washington establishment, that I'd be easy to intimidate." She smiled slightly. "But what you discovered is that my generation doesn't get our information from legacy media anymore. We don't defer to authority figures just because they have fancy titles or family money. We do our own research, we check facts in real time, and we're not afraid to call out bias when we see it." Cooper made one last desperate attempt to salvage the interview. "Congresswoman, I think we're getting off track here." "No, Anderson, I think we're finally on track," Leavitt replied. "For the first time in this interview, we're having an honest conversation about what's really happening here." She gathered her things and began removing her microphone. "You brought me on this show to attack me, and instead you've demonstrated exactly why Americans don't trust mainstream media anymore. You've shown that CNN is more interested in political theater than actual journalism." She stood up from her chair. "I came here prepared to discuss policy, to explain my positions, to engage in the kind of substantive conversation that voters deserve. But you're not interested in that. You're interested in gotcha moments and viral clips." She looked directly into the camera one more time. "To the people watching at home, this is why we need new voices in Washington. This is why we need representatives who aren't afraid to challenge the media establishment that's been lying to you for decades." And with that, she walked off the set, leaving Cooper sitting alone in stunned silence. The interview had been broadcast live, and clips were already spreading across social media before Leavitt had even left the building. But unlike Cooper's usual viral moments, these clips didn't make him look authoritative or insightful. They showed him being systematically dismantled by someone young enough to be his daughter. The response was immediate and overwhelming. "Cooper Destroyed" was trending on Twitter within an hour. Conservative media figures were sharing the clips with commentary about how Leavitt had exposed mainstream media bias. Even some liberal commentators admitted that Cooper had been outclassed. But the real damage came from CNN's own audience. Viewers who trusted Cooper for years were shocked to see him so thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone he'd clearly underestimated. Comments on CNN's social media pages were brutal. How did he not see that coming? She made him look like an amateur. Maybe it's time for new blood at CNN. The network's executives were in crisis mode within 48 hours. Cooper's interview with Leavitt had become a case study in how not to handle hostile guests, and it was being used by media critics as evidence of CNN's declining journalistic standards. More damaging was the scrutiny that followed. Journalists began fact-checking Cooper's questions, finding that several of his characterizations of Leavitt's positions had been misleading or outright false. Media watchdog groups used the interview as an example of how bias could undermine journalistic credibility. The breaking point came when CNN's own media correspondent published an analysis piece criticizing Cooper's interview techniques and suggesting that the network needed to reconsider its approach to political coverage. 3 weeks after the disastrous interview, CNN announced that Cooper would be transitioning to new opportunities and would no longer host his primetime show. The official statement thanked him for his years of service, but notably didn't defend his recent performance. Cooper's departure sent shockwaves through the media world. He'd been one of CNN's most recognizable faces, someone who'd survived multiple network shakeups and maintained his position through decades of changing media landscapes. His firing suggested that even the most established journalists weren't immune to consequences when they were caught being unprofessional. Leavitt, meanwhile, saw her national profile skyrocket. The interview had showcased not just her policy knowledge, but her ability to handle hostile media with intelligence and composure. Political strategists from both parties began studying her approach as a model for how to deal with biased journalists. In her first major interview after Cooper's firing, Leavitt was asked what she'd hoped to accomplish in that confrontation. "I wanted to show young conservatives that you don't have to accept being talked down to by media elites," she said. "Anderson Cooper thought he could intimidate me because I'm young and new to Washington. But what he discovered is that my generation doesn't play by the old rules." She continued, "We don't defer to authority just because someone has a fancy job title. We check facts, we call out bias, and we're not afraid to fight back when we're attacked unfairly." The interviewer asked if she felt bad about ending Cooper's career. "I didn't end Anderson Cooper's career," Leavitt replied. "He ended it himself by abandoning journalistic standards in favor of political advocacy. I just exposed what he was really doing." The lesson was clear in an age of social media, and instant fact-checking media bias can backfire spectacularly when it encounters someone who's prepared to fight back. And when traditional authority meets authentic preparation, authenticity wins every time. Anderson Cooper thought he could destroy Karoline Leavitt's political career with a hostile interview designed to make her look inexperienced and extreme. Instead, he exposed himself as a biased journalist who'd confused his platform with actual authority, his reputation with real credibility. His career-ending encounter with Leavitt became a perfect example of what happens when media elitism meets generational change, when established bias confronts prepared authenticity, and when someone who's earned their position faces someone who was simply born into theirs.